Good evening, folklorists. Peace, everyone. I'd like to remind everyone that the folk belief and religious folklife section as a silent auction in the book room, and please go in there and bid up everything. It supports not Maggie, Kruesi, and I. It does not support any of our meals here. It goes to the William Wilson undergraduate paper prize and the Don Yoder graduate student paper prize. And again, for anyone who will remember this next year, do not forget that you can apply for those, or tell your students or friends to apply for those prizes. And tomorrow at noon at our section meeting, we will announce the 2013 William Wilson undergraduate prize and the 2013 Don Yoder graduate student prize. I'm happy to announce. So that will happen at that time. Now it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Don Yoder, Dr. Yoder. Well, I have to say, the last time Dr. Yoder was here was 2006, is when he gave the Don Yoder lecture, and this happens to be the 10th anniversary of the Don Yoder lecture. Now, why this is special for me is that in 2006, I couldn't be here to introduce Dr. Yoder because I was getting ready to go into the hospital, ostensibly maybe to die, and guess what? I didn't. And so, here I am with this tremendous pleasure, so many years later, to introduce Don, and it's really a great personal pleasure for me to do that. Don Yoder was the professor of religious studies while he was professor in the Department of Religious Thought at the University of Pennsylvania, then a professor in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, and then professor of Folklore and Folklife Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. He's now the emeritus professor there. And what words could we use to describe Don? Historian, scholar of American religion, folklorist, folklife scholar, scholar of genealogy, scholar of the German language in America, scholar of Quaker culture, scholar of Pennsylvania Dutch culture. What, of course, those of us that know him know that he is and has been a tremendous force in the lives of his students and really changed their lives in many cases. He's the winner of the Lindback Distinguished Teaching Award at the University of Pennsylvania. And one of his many personal traditions is that he likes to eat pie for breakfast. I'm happy to say that. He is going to present a lecture to you today, and then he's going to present a slide lecture after that. And so that is the way it's going to work. And then Professor Jerry Poches is going to give a response to what Dr. Yoder says. So I'd like to introduce a real legend in our discipline, and even beyond that, a true national treasure of the United States of America. I'd like to introduce the 2013 Don Yoder lecturer, Don Yoder.
Thank you very much, Leonard, for that very gracious introduction. The only thing my relatives upstate in Pennsylvania would have said, I'm emeritus, and not emeritus. I'm very happy to be giving the Don Yoder lecture this year. I did give it a few years ago also, but I'm very happy that it's not the Don Yoder Memorial. I'm very happy that we have such a nice group here today. Tonight, I'd like to know how many are my students. Raise your hand. It's very impressive, and I wish you all well in your careers, your life, work, going on from where you are now. I'm going to speak on religion and folk art, and especially comparing the difference between Catholic and Protestant forms of religious art. The earliest glimmerings of the discovery of folk art, along with the concept of folk and folk group, as well as the individual genres of folk song and folk tale, date from the period of the Enlightenment. It was in that period of Europe's intellectual development that government officials, clergy, and the ambitious and self-conscious middle class of the cities, as well as the new free-thinking and anti-ecclesiastical intellectuals, all discovered the peasants. The peasants had been a necessary part of Europe's economic and class structure for centuries, but as a group, a society, a culture, they had never before interested upper-class and middle-class Europeans. When peasant culture was discovered in the Enlightenment, it provided the intelligentsia at the time with one more human curiosity to be housed and occasionally to be looked at in one's cabinet of curiosities. The philosophers laughed at peasant superstitions. The romantics idealized the peasant, along with the noble savage, and left a legacy of new mythology which has not yet disappeared. More seriously, native European savants began in the 18th century to study the variety of human lifestyles in Europe, both from the Lapps in the far north to the Sicilians and Calabrians in the south, from the people of the steppes and the Balkan minorities in the east, and on the far west, the Atlantic edge of Europe, the Basques and Bretons, the Britons, and the Iberians and the Celtic groups of the British Isles. It was not until the 19th and 20th centuries, however, that the collectors, the museums, and the university scholars focused seriously on the folk arts and began to make sense out of them. This was done by several groups of scholars: the art historians, the anthropologists and sociologists, the folk culture school scholars of Europe, and the folklore scholars of Britain and America. The art historians, like the architectural historians, have until recent decades found it difficult to deal with folk art as art unless it is viewed as a debased, less competent attempt to imitate elite forms. Anthropologists focused, again until recently, principally upon non-Western primitive arts, but in studying these arts in cultural context, they have developed a useful body of theory relating art and society in general. The folk cultural scholars of the continent looked at their own cultures and went beyond the anthropologists and sociologists in taking a long historical view of the phenomena under discussion, as well as observing these phenomena through ethnographic fieldwork in the present. One cannot really say that the European ethnologists, as folklife researchers prefer to call themselves in the European academic setting, borrowed the ethnographic method from anthropology, since European scholars were using it on their own cultures long before anthropology made its appearance as an academic discipline. But as they moved from a genre-oriented and textually based view of European tradition to functional and sociological orientations, European ethnologists came to view the folk arts as functioning parts of a social entity, that is, a group, whether that group was rural or urban. The folk arts of the past centuries are so vast in Europe and the collection so rich that the majority of European ethnologists still prefer to focus on the earlier classic periods of folk art production, 16th to 19th centuries, although a growing minority has become excited with the study of the folk or group arts of the present. This excitement with the present moves the scholar across the line into the popular culture and mass production of print, song, and symbol. American folklorists have recently followed the same path, with a new emphasis on industrial folklore and urban folklore. The tendency in what is increasingly called folkloristics in this country, however, is to look at folklore as the group expression of small groups, skirting, in my opinion, the requirement of a continuing tradition from past to present in definitions of folk phenomena, and the new performance theory school, which sees the folk arts as the mutual and creative communication between performers and audiences. This approach, of course, fits music and dance better than the visual arts or other aspects of material culture. In providing a method for the study of the repertoires of individual living artists, this school links hands with the school which defines American folk art as including the work of an individual artist as well as group art. The historical origins of folk art are even more complex than the theories that have been developed to explain them. While the classic folk arts of Europe, as defined by European scholarship, are post-Renaissance, dating roughly from the 16th to the 20th centuries, a case can be built up for the omnipresence of folk art in every society and its continuity from antiquity to the present. Basic forms and symbols in classic European folk art can be traced to prehistoric models, some of them at least, and related to primitive counterparts. Like everything else in modern culture, these relationships have sometimes been linked together in an evolutionary theory. An equally important historical theory uses the two-level model of culture to explain the relation of folk forms to the high, elite, or sophisticated forms which are identified with the changing, fashionable culture of the upper classes. This theory was developed in Europe by scholars who saw the folk as reproducing rather than producing, as adaptive rather than culturally creative. To them, folk culture was a dated melange of borrowed elements selectively chosen by the, quote, peasants for their own use. The process involved can be called devolution, since it is based on the premise that cultural traits normally descend from the creative elite to the receptive folk levels of a culture. Involved on the receiving or folk end of the process are selective adaptation, seen in folk costume, imitation of high forms by folk craftsmen, seen in the transmutation of the carved or inlaid Renaissance chest into the painted peasant chest, and the simplification by stylizing, as seen, for example, in reverse glass painting. The difficulty with this second theory, with all of its undoubted proofs from various areas of folk culture, is that it is blind to the equally obvious factor of folk creativity. Fortunately, the recent research in the folk aesthetic can correct the one-sided character of the theory. Henry Glassey's useful metaphor of the folk filter goes a long way toward explaining the process whereby folk art is created. As he puts it, the folk artist, painter, or carver filters post-Renaissance naturalistic art to suit the folk taste, which prefers abstract forms, frontality, symmetry, repetition, and two-dimensional perspective. In the Middle Ages, the folk and elite arts were often inseparable. Since the Renaissance, their paths have separated, with Renaissance art moving from convention to realism, while folk art continues the earlier non-realist conventions. The historic and sociological complexity of folk art makes an overall definition difficult, but we may as well dip our oar into the troubled waters of definition. Actually, Americans as well as Europeans have been attempting to define folk art since the 19th century, with different levels of success and results varying between European and American schools of thought. The American definitions, most of which have come out of collecting in museum circles, take an across-the-board pan-American approach and center about beautiful, useful, decorated objects or whimsical things produced by out-of-the-way, self-educated, or informally trained craftsmen, whether or not they relate to a definable social group. It is true that some American folk art scholarship, for example that on French-Canadian, Hispanic-American, and Pennsylvania Dutch artistic production, deals with specific groups in time. But in the usual overall definition, America is viewed as a vast composite of group and individual productions which are labeled by the rubric American folk art or folk art in America. The breadth of this definition enables one to include within it all genres of individual folk art, as well as primitive portraiture and the productions of idiosyncratic artists such as yesterday's Edward Hicks or today's Howard Finster. Yesterday's Howard Finster. Hence, the American definition has the very real advantage of including present-day contemporary folk art phenomena. European definitions normally view the folk arts as the products of self-conscious social groups which express their common tradition in visible productions. Folk groups, urban groups, ethnic minorities, or religious sects, for example. these visible productions, folk art is after all a part of a group's entire material culture, must be viewed in terms of the function they serve in the culture that produces them. Furthermore, the individual pieces in this artistic repertory must be linked to the symbolic tradition of the groups in both form and decoration. In other words, the individual folk artist, while expressing his own individual insights into reality, must work with and within his group's traditional vocabulary of symbols. If there are essentially two schools in the interpretation of folk art, there are two major ways of defining religious folk art. Again, we can summarize the European definition as follows. Religious folk art is the visual production of self-conscious, folk-culturally oriented or tradition-based groups, expressing on their own level of understanding and aesthetics their shared religious symbols and ideology. The broad, inclusive American definition was expressed in the title of the exhibit, exhibition and conference called Religious Folk Art in America, Reflections of Faith, for which I wrote this paper in 1984. There are some dated materials in it which I don't have to point out. When we look at the European roots of American culture, we find that in looking at religious folk art, the scholars have focused principally on the differences between the Catholic and the Protestant forms. There is a demonstrable uniformity of theme and form in European Catholic folk art across national boundaries, with some regional differences, and there is likewise uniformity as well as regionality in European Protestant art forms and expressions. In the United States, the situation is somewhat more complicated. In the American Catholic world, the various ethnic components of the Catholic Church express their understanding of the Catholic faith through varying folk art expressions transported with the immigrants from Europe and reinforcing their ethnic identity here. In the Protestant camp, there is regional and group variety as well. Let us look now at the differences between the two very different worlds of Catholic folk art and Protestant folk art, as the two major varieties of religious folk art in both Western Europe and America. It was Richard Weiss, a professor of European ethnology at the University of Zurich, who led Europe's scholars in the analytic study of the differences between Catholic and Protestant folk art. It is significant that the awareness of this differentiation grew out of his work on his own culture, that of Switzerland, which is transitional between Germanic Europe on the north and Mediterranean Europe on the south, between the elite cultural orbits of Paris on the west and Vienna on the east, and between the worlds of Catholicism and Protestantism. Let us look at his results with some of my own research shown in for good measure. I wanted to speak in my interview this morning about a wonderful day that I spent with Richard Weiss at his home at Küsnacht on the Lake of Zurich, and we discussed how we became interested in our own cultures. And I told about my grandfather that I mentioned this morning, and he said that his grandfather had a Graubünden farm in the Alps that he spent his summers at, and he became interested in Swiss folk culture through that experience. But he also invited me back the next year, and we would travel through Switzerland. He would show me some of the treasures, folk cultural treasures, areas like the Zuricher Oberland, which produced a lot of the Anabaptists and so forth. But alas, next spring, I read that he had been killed in an alpine mountain accident. Sad, great loss, Richard Weiss. Working from his own Swiss base, which furnishes classic examples of both types of religion, Professor Weiss drew up a useful list of what we can call the laws of Catholic folk piety. These can be summarized as follows, and I'm going to digest this and just give the main points. I have paragraphs about each of these points, but we don't have time for them. First of all, he said, Catholicism concretizes the abstract. It believes in the transcendental holiness of divinity, but it makes contact with that holiness in and through sacral material objects in the everyday. Secondly, this Catholic concretizing of abstract spiritual principles involves the acting out of these principles in religious ritual, in religious drama, in processions on holy days, in pilgrimages to holy shrines, and other things. Thirdly, as an outgrowth of the first point, one can add that Catholic piety decentralizes the divine action into local, regional cults, and the cults of the Virgin Mary, of Shostakova, and Guadalupe, and Lourdes, and Fatima, and so forth, show that idea. 4, the psychology of Catholic piety contains an element of permitted sensualism, which is expressed in the visual beauty of church art on both the official and folk levels. Because in the Catholic world, art is an adjunct to holiness and an aid to spirituality, and certain pieces of art become holy or may be treated as holy things, human love and affection can be lavished upon them. An icon or crucifix can be kissed. The Virgin and one's favorite saints can become spiritual members of one's family, unseen but present, to be talked to and addressed to in prayer. But even the unseen character of these spiritual companions can break through into everyday life in the vision or hierophany, the appearance of the saint to man. And after having said that, I want to make a statement by John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, who advised his ministers not to use fondling expressions in relation to the deity. And that doesn't go with the Catholic sensuality in devotion. The Catholic division of the world into sacred and secular spheres, it is in a sense one of many Catholic hierarchies, sacred above, secular below. While some phenomena are intrinsically holy, this does not mean that common secular things must always remain secular. Natural or secular things can become sacred through blessing or benediction. The use of images or icons, painted, carved, or printed representations of holy beings which themselves achieve relative holiness and are used in devotion as ritual objects, is a widespread basic part of the public worship of Catholicism. Catholic churches and chapels are full of holy pictures and statues. Similar objects, for example, the folk santos, or carved wooden saints of the Hispanic world, are also used in home devotions, and so forth. In Catholic homes, the principal sacred area is the so-called Holy Corner, where images are placed, usually on shelves above the table where the family eats. This holy corner is the devotional focus of the Catholic house. Whether or not prayers are uttered to consecrate them, meals have always been considered holy in primitive and peasant societies. The holy corner is a house altar or family altar toward which prayers can be directed and around which devotions are centered. The so-called holy pictures displayed are those of holy beings of the universe who are appealed to through prayer, the Trinity, the Virgin, and the saints. The art involved ranges from folk-produced pictures, reverse glass paintings, and so forth, to fine engravings, sometimes framed in folk frames like the Mexican Marquito framing of a Mexican-American popular print using the colors of the Mexican flag. This production of holy pictures, images, santos, holy cards, and other Catholic devotional art is immense and involves every technique known to the arts. My rule is to include all of these under my rubric of Catholic folk art, no matter who produced them, if they function in a folk cultural setting, like our own devotions. The Catholic belief in the holiness of material objects extends to holy places. The pilgrimage system of ancient, medieval, and modern Catholicism, to the shrines of the saints, to the whole so-called Holy Land, to the chapels of wonder-working statues, or to the village homes of living saints, as for example stigmatics like Teresa Neumann in Bavaria and Padre Pio in Italy, reveals the basic Catholic belief in the miraculous intervention of God in the natural world. The healing shrines and cults of the Catholic world are responsible for the ex votos, or votive pictures, that vast body of pictorial Catholic folk art, which, like religious ballads, tells stories, in this case of miracles, healings, rescues, answers to prayer. The European collections of these, as for example the Rudolf Christ collection, in the Bayerisches Nationalmuseum in Munich, the Bavarian National Museum, or the Richter collection in the Germanisches Museum in Nuremberg, and the many books that have come out in this century on this genre of Catholic folk art reveal the universality of this type of expression, as well as its importance for interpreting both the religion and traditional culture of Catholic areas. The ex voto usually portrays three elements. First, the votant, or person who makes the vow. We'll illustrate this with pictures later, representing man in his hour of need. Second, the world of the votant, pictorially detailing the situation that evoked the vow. And three, the spiritual power to whom the prayer and vow were addressed. Since Roman Catholic art, like everything else about Roman Catholicism, has a hierarchical orientation, even the folk art of Catholicism expresses the spiritual levels of the Catholic universe. These include the spiritual theaters of heaven, earth, hell, and purgatory, as well as the levels of spiritual power that make up that universe, the Trinity, the Virgin Mary, the saints, archangels and angels, and on the other side, Satan and his demonic hosts. I have had at home, which is now in the Cabrini Don Yoder folk art, religious folk art collection, a Portuguese house altar made in a shadow box about 5 inches deep, and I found this at a flea market in Lisbon on one of my many European trips, and brought it home, cradled against my knees on Swiss air, and it didn't break. It showed the Catholic orientation. Vertically, you had the Trinity, you had God the Father blessing all of his creation down below, the dove under him representing the Holy Spirit, and down below the little boy Jesus standing at an altar table, and there were real candles at this altar table, and the whole thing was decorated with tinsel, red tinsel and gold and so forth. A very beautiful example of homemade home devotion, and I treasured this until I send it to the Cabrini collection. These folk diagrams of the Catholic spiritual universe are like the ex voto and rituals and processions and all the outward elements of Catholicism, a constant reassurance to the Catholic believer that the world is spiritually on base. I think that is the reason why these things exist. Now, Protestantism. The Reformation of the 16th century attempted both to simplify and to intellectualize the Christian religion, reforming the Catholic model into new Protestant forms. The aim was the recreation of pure pre-medieval Christianity, but what resulted was the creation of radical new forms of post-medieval Christianity. The essential difference between Catholicism and Protestantism is described by the American sociologist of religion, Peter Berger, to the gradual removal by the Protestants of the sacred canopy, as he calls it, of religion in the development of the modern secular conception of the world. And this is what Berger says. If compared with the fullness of the Catholic universe, Protestantism appears as a radical truncation, a reduction to essentials at the expense of a vast wealth of religious contents. This is especially true of the Calvinist version of Protestantism, but it's also true of Lutheranism and Anglicanism. He uses the phrase also that the process has been aptly caught in the phrase disenchantment of the world. The Protestants, with their emphasis on education and the new forms of religion, disenchanted the world. And he says that they gave up three of the most important things which have existed in religion from the very beginning: mystery, magic, and miracle. And he said, religiously speaking, for the Protestant, the world became very lonely indeed. I think this is an interesting idea. As a Protestant, I can say it is interesting. Visual artistic expression in and across the board. Because of this, this loneliness of the Protestant in the universe was to have profound effects in the realm of the arts. In a critique of medieval Catholic piety, Protestantism was the first template like Judaism to give up all visual artistic expression in an across-the-board iconoclasm. With the exception, however, of the radical reformers and several non-typical and iconic sects, a Protestant art, and even a Protestant folk art, developed in most European Protestant cultures. But since the nerve was cut that led from the sacred canopy to the holy picture and the holy statue, Protestant art therefore went into other directions. The great Protestant art was, after all, music, from Bach to the spiritual. The Word, the Bible in particular, was the center of the Protestant faith. Music was permitted because it was capable of combination with holy words in the hymn and the oratorio. Likewise, even for the most Puritan of Protestants, art was permitted if it combined decorative elements with holy words, the holy text. Art for art's sake was worldly, useless, even sinful. Pictures alone were dangerous to the Protestant, a temptation to idolatry. In the European culture dominated by the Reformation, where senses and emotions were to be held in check, embellished texts replaced holy pictures and statues as the one universally permitted form of art for Protestants. This is the first rule of difference between Protestant and Catholic folk art as they developed in Western Europe and America. Protestant art was an art of the Word, the Bible text, the hymn verse, the prayer, the house blessing. This new textual art was devotional, admonitory, and consolatory, providing for the Protestant beholder cues to the devotional, moral, and spiritual teachings of his church. Catholic art was, on the other hand, essentially a pictorial art, a portrayal on the level of folk piety of the miracles and powers of the spiritual universe breaking through into the world of man. If the central form of the spectrum, in the spectrum of Catholic folk art can be considered the ex voto, or votive picture, which I've described, the central type in the Protestant folk art spectrum is what I call Protestant manuscript art. And the principal example of that in America, the largest body of it, is the Pennsylvania Dutch type of art called fraktur, decorated art texts which are decorated with some designs. This large central body of Protestant art differs in content from its Catholic counterpart in being textual rather than pictorial. It does have some pictorial elements, but the central thing on fraktur is always the text, the religious text. It also differs in the context of its production and in the context of its function within society. Protestant folk art was based on the rites of passage, which related the individual to his community, as that individual moves from birth through baptism to confirmation, marriage, and eventually death and burial. Hence, the center of production of this art was the Protestant parish community with its parochial school. All the Lutheran, Reformed, Mennonite, and other groups in Pennsylvania and the Pennsylvania Dutch world had their own schools before the public schools came in the 1830s. Again, using Pennsylvania Dutch manuscript art as our focus, it is not a coincidence that most fraktur was produced by ministers or parochial schoolmasters. It was they, after all, who were the bearers and conservers of the official tradition of what was holy in Protestant society. And it was they, for the most part, who mediated that tradition to the people. The texts which they used were not only favorite biblical citations from Old and New Testaments, and also the Apocrypha. The German Bible always had the Old Testament Apocrypha in it, but were also drawn from the two great Protestant adjuncts to the Bible, the hymn book and the prayer book. Like all devotional literature, these texts reassured the traditional Protestant of the past in his spiritually lonely universe. There were two main types of fraktur, the baptismal certificate, or Taufschein, and the example of fine calligraphy called a Vorschrift, written for the students. And these were often given as gifts to favorite students at the end of the school year, which was usually around Easter. And these pictures were not for framing. They winter tour has a fraktur room with all these fraktur pieces framed, and they were never framed and put up for display because that would be art for art's sake. They were personal documents. They belonged to the individual for whom who was baptized and whom the Taufschein was for, and that sort of thing. They were put away in the Bibles, or they were sometimes pasted on the inside lid, inside of the lid of the person's chest, blanket chest, and sometimes looked at, and you remembered when you read them the teachings of the teacher or the minister who had produced them. The Bible and official Protestant texts were not the only source of motifs for art-producing Protestants. They were the main ones, but not the only ones. Their art also channeled syncretistic religious themes from the past into the folk cultural present. Involved here were ideas and motifs from that vast and ancient folk religious world which the immigrants brought along in their minds and hearts from European homelands. One example of this is the many Pennsylvania Dutch baptismal certificates that display what formerly were thought to be mermaids. I mentioned this, I think, this morning. Unlike the New England Yankees, the Pennsylvania Dutch had no maritime or sea-oriented background. The mermaids have turned out to be those landlocked water spirits of European folk religion, folk tradition, which were assigned in Germanic folklore the place usually ascribed to the stork in bringing babies into the world. Grimm's Deutsche Mythologie mentions this and says that when a baby was expected, the midwife, who was always there to help the mother get the baby, went out to the woods, went to a spring and reached down, and the water spirit, or whatever it's called, reached the baby up, and the midwife took the baby back to the mother. That's a very interesting stork substitute, which you can take along home. Protestant manuscript art, like the Catholic ex voto, can also provide a portrayal of the spiritual universe. Unlike the ex voto, however, Protestant art rarely attempts to portray the actual spiritual powers of the universe, like the Virgin Mary, the Trinity, and so forth. Instead, man's spiritual orientation is subtly shown in the structural arrangement of the fraktur piece itself. Many pieces of fraktur, for example, show two orientations. The orientation of the written text is from top to bottom, the way one normally reads a text. But the inward orientation of the piece is from bottom to top, from earth to heaven, the path of the soul. And these, very often, you have flowers growing at the bottom of the fraktur piece and little angels up at the top, suggesting this orientation. But Protestantism in history is a complex protean movement. There was more than one Protestant reaction to art and to the Catholic expressions of art. The question whether Puritanism and the plain sectarian movements aesthetically related to it permitted art has been much debated. Most of them considered art for art's sake, that is, art for display and art for aesthetic enjoyment, worldly and therefore questionable, really sinful. Where art could be combined with the didactic religious elements, it was permitted. Hence, the Puritans, who were supposed to have been totally anti-art, permitted portraits, because holy individuals in the community were looked up to as role models in a sacred society. Also permitted was tombstone or memento mori art. Certainly the most elaborate tombstone art in colonial America originated in New England. And Ludwig spoke on that. It's absolutely magnificent. Manuscript art, too, was allowed, particularly family registers and related pieces. But they never achieved in New England the widespread flowering that fraktur achieved in Pennsylvania. Even Quakers, who were anti-art in a great sense, the girls made samplers, which are a form of art, and sometimes they were framed and put up on the walls, although not always. And if painted portraits were too arty for the plainest of Quakers, especially for country friends, they did permit the silhouette, since the silhouette was an outline cast by light, a natural shadow, part of the natural world, and therefore an evidence of truth. In the last 4 centuries of development since the Protestant reformations of the 16th century, certain general Protestant movements have arisen which have radically changed the viewpoint of many Protestants toward art. In fact, many Protestant groups have gone through a re-Catholicizing of the Protestant emotions. And the same emotions which a devout Catholic focused on the Virgin Mary and the saints would be focused by a pietist Protestant or evangelical Protestant today on Christ himself. And Christ would be the unseen guest in the house and so forth. There are many inscriptions that people have in their houses. Christ is the unseen guest of this house, that sort of thing. The same idea that the Catholics have with the saints and the Virgin Mary as a spiritual companion in the house. In the 20th century, Protestantism and Catholicism have drawn closer to each other, fortunately. Catholicism has adopted many aspects of modern Christianity, usually considered Protestant, such as hymn singing and vernacular services. Through the high church movements, Protestantism has partially re-Catholicized its liturgy, has in its new clerical costumes adopted something of the pageantry of Catholicism, and has been too quick, some conservatives feel, to adopt Catholic symbols such as the outward cross, which now caps most Protestant churches from high to low. It's rather interesting that the cross, the outward cross, was considered in Protestant art. It didn't exist in Protestant art because Protestants considered it a Catholic symbol, the outward cross. They believed in the cross, they preached the cross, they sang about the cross in their hymns, but they never pictured it, even on tombstones. And now even Mennonite churches and meeting houses have crosses. They put them back of the pulpit and so forth. It's rather an interesting change. They don't know the past of their own cultures. The ultimate reason for the great flowering of both Catholic and Protestant folk art in the past lies in the root base out of which their art grew. Before the social revolutions of the 19th and 20th centuries, both Catholics and Protestants lived in that earlier stage of human development that Howard Becker and other sociologists refer to as sacred societies. The sacred society's alternation of work and worship, and in fact all its ways of relating the sacred and the secular, were very different from the way we do things today. Our modern society is based on multiple relationships, multiple involvements, multiple communities. We possess only a very faded sense of the sacred. Few of us normally have holy corners in our apartments. In fact, our homes have customarily no devotional focus at all anymore, except unless we recognize this, we'll date this paper, the television screen as its modern counterpart. You could also say the computer screen to bring it up to date. Even in most American rural homes, the farmer's almanac, with its sense of sacred time, has been replaced by the TV guide. Prime time has supplanted sacred time. And if we add a TV dinner to the picture, we can claim the complete secularization of the ancestral peasant meal. This fading of the sense of the sacred, this removal of the sacred canopy, to use Peter Berger's interesting phrase, is today true of both Catholics and Protestants. Vatican II modernized Catholic piety and put the saint system on a rational basis, or tried to, demoting the less documented figures, the Philomenas and the Christopers. I don't know what the Neapolitans would do without the name Philomena. It's a very popular South Italian name. Protestant churches have increasingly become social clubs, and according to University of Chicago sociologist Gibson Winter, have been captured by suburbia and its common denominator, split-level spirit. Whether the new wave of fundamentalist, Bible-based, born-again, moral majority Protestants, or the equally new wave of Oriental cults that are putting down roots among the college population in America, will produce a new wave of religious folk art remains to be seen. Judging the former, the Protestants, from its current propaganda, it is in the grip of a popular culture aesthetic and a pietist evangelical view of Christianity. Judging the Oriental movements from their street handouts and official publications, it continues under the spell of Hindu and Buddhist popular iconography. And now a few suggestions about directions of folk art research, religious folk art research, that we need to go into. One of the things that I mentioned in this section is that a popular religious art has developed, which in most cases has totally replaced the old religious folk art. Nobody makes fraktur anymore, and we have popular prints and other popular things that are displayed on Protestant walls and Catholic walls. This is plain. I made a study of Catholic book store catalogs and religious object stores, and having come partly from the Reformed Church of Zwingli in Zurich, my family, and so forth, I looked at the United Church of Christ, which is a descendant of Zwingli's Reformed Church in America today, at their catalog of Philadelphia religious objects and bookstores. And everything was covered with, everything was made out of plastic, rustic wood plaques of St. Francis's Prayer, the plastic encased mustard seed, the plastic praying hands, the plastic Jesus, and so forth. And everything had Bible verses on. And I said at the end of this discussion, Zwingli, thou shouldst be living at this hour. And Zwingli wouldn't recognize any of it. It's all kitsch. And I used the word kitsch. And I love the German word. The Germans have divisions of kitsch. There is kitsch and there is edelkitsch, which is so gross and in such bad taste that it deserves the word edel and noble. I wanted to mention one or two more things, or I still have a few minutes, I believe. Here's a good paragraph. Human needs apparently remain constant. I love the way I began that. Human tastes continue to vary along the lines of class and cult. But the production of folk, popular, or everyday art, literature, and music continue, using the new technologies on the old themes. There is one major change in content which has come about in our time. The new mythologies of science fiction, of the star system of cinema, television, and popular entertainment, of Disney films and Disneyland, and of space exploitation and fantasy have already begun to register in the world of the popular print. That this is a worldwide phenomenon was registered in my mind very vividly several years ago when I observed in a religious objects shop in Seville, in Spain of course, triangular paper banners for mounting in car windows. On the same rack with those of La Macarena, Seville's own beloved Our Lady, the cult of Our Lady is called La Macarena in Seville, were displayed Lorne Greene, Haas Cartwright, and the rest of the cast of the American TV show Bonanza. That would date this paper also, but I think some of you remember Bonanza. Our research on religious folk art can also enlighten us on the relation of the individual to the traditional community. It has frequently been said that folk art is always anonymous art, selflessly produced by members of the community who literally paint themselves out of the picture. If most of the folk artists are anonymous to us today, it does not follow that they were anonymous and unknown in their own communities. It is better to say with Arnold Hauser that the works of folk art are not necessarily anonymous, but they are always impersonal. There were cultural reasons why our folk artists rarely signed their pieces or claimed them. In the earlier sacred societies, individualism was subsumed under group identity. This was symbolized, for example, in the separation of men and women in all of our churches and meeting houses in the past. The Mennonites, some of them still do it. Families did not sit together in church as today, but rather when the individual entered the church door, he entered as a member of God's family rather than of his own little nuclear family. The relationship of the art-producing individual to his community can also be studied in another way as well. Louis Chiaramonte's dissertation done on the relation of the Newfoundland boat builder to his clientele can provide suggestive models for research in our field of art. What was the relationship, for example, between the fraktur producing minister, schoolmaster, or itinerant, the euphemism for tramp, to the persons for whom Taufschein, Vorschrift, and other folk documents were drawn up? Or in Catholic cultures, between the ex-voto artist, the mask carver, or the santero, who made the santos, and their clientele? Can we adapt producer-client or performance theory to illuminate this relationship? Finally, we need more comparative studies, yes, more, not less, on the symbolic vocabulary in religious folk art. In the Catholic areas, we need more comparative study of both the universal Catholic saints and the favorite local saints that appear in ex-votos, reverse glass paintings, santos, and prints, and so forth. In Protestant context, we need more comparative study of the symbols and texts of our manuscript art. We need cross-genre studies which will trace these symbols from the visual artistic expression back into the Protestant devotional literature, which is their source. Symbols like the much-debated Tree of Life and whirling swastika have to be analyzed both cross-culturally and historically. After all, whirling swastikas have nothing to do with the Nazis at all. They've been in folk art for hundreds of years. They're found in manuscript art, on tombstones, on book covers, even Bible covers, on pottery, even on punched tin pie safes, and of course, most spectacularly on the Pennsylvania Dutch barn forays. And I showed a book this morning, a new book by Patrick Dunmoyer called Hex Signs, on the meaning, myth and meaning in the Pennsylvania Dutch barn stars. And this is, he goes into all of these symbols in a very interesting and new way. The cross-cultural study of religious folk art can enlighten us also on the intercultural connections of the religions of Western civilization. I have used Catholicism and Protestantism as my principal examples in attempting to analyze and describe the religious folk art of Western Europe and America. If one takes Europe as a whole, the elaborate arts of Eastern Christendom deserve equal billing, as do the arts of the two other religions that have influenced Europe so much spiritually and culturally, Judaism and Islam. Certainly the relation of Judaism and Protestantism in such areas as Alsace, where both groups live together in the villages, deserves a closer look for interpretation of symbolism. I registered this in my mind as a possible subject for many doctoral dissertations when I discovered those magnificent rooms on the Jewish village culture, Alsatian village culture, and its religious art on display in the Musée Alsacien, the Alsatian Museum in Strasbourg. In conclusion, right on the dot of 9 o'clock, religious folk art is a worldwide phenomenon. It exists in complex societies, like folk religion in general, usually in some degree of tension with the elite or organized forms of art and religion. It has been produced in its classic forms, usually in the pre-industrial stages of the civilization. Substitutes for it, modern folk art, if you will, although that term is questionable, although we need a more precise term, are flooding the market today from the plastic factories, the denominational presses, and the religious supply stores. And that is the end of my paper formally. And we're going to look at some slides, not slides, but a PowerPoint that Leonard and I put together from the internet. And I hope you enjoy it. And then we'll have Jerry Posius giving comments on that paper.
You have a blog now?
I have to turn it around.
All right, Don, you ready?
Yeah, but
Are you ready, audience?
yeah,
Image number one.
I'm always ready. We're starting with Catholic folk art in this very nice print from a New York publisher from the Victorian era. showing, it says the Sacred Heart, but it's actually in Catholic terminology, the Immaculate Heart of Mary, showing the devotion toward Mary in American Catholicism. It's a good print to start with, and the next print is the Sacred Heart also, with the flames coming from it, and surrounded by roses or some sort of Victorian beautification of the sadness of this picture, and of course the sword piercing the heart of Mary. And I suppose the dove is the Holy Spirit above. The next picture shows this same print as it was on the walls of a Catholic home. I love that wallpaper, and I wanted to mention that Jerry Posius wrote for me one time a very important paper on the Catholic and Protestant popular art as displayed in the homes of the common Newfoundland residents. It's a magnificent paper, and I hope it will be published. Anyway, I like this picture because it shows you the setting of that print in a house somewhere. I don't know what state it was in. Thank you. Next one. And this, of course, couldn't be anything but Protestant. And, a sign along the road, I have accepted Jesus as Lord and Savior, believe. And this, of course, represents a significant portion of Protestants who are, we call them evangelicals, or the term is different from the use of the term evangelical in the 19th century. It's much more narrow today. And these are the people who are conservative Protestants and put up signs along the road. Next. This is Protestant art, and it's rather interesting. It shows, it's mostly text, but there is some design. The two confrontal birds, which may mean something and may not, with the flowers at the bottom. And up at the top, you have cherubs looking out of flowers, I guess. And it's a hymn, a very important hymn, which the Amish still use, by the way. Zu singen habe ich im Sinn, wollt doch viel lieber weinen, wenn ich gedenk, wer ich bin. I would like to sing, the singer says, but I would rather weep when I think what I am, think who I am. A statement of the human condition in general. And this is still in the hymnal which the Amish still use, the gospel. Next. This, of course, is Eastern European, Romanian, I believe, picture of the Virgin and the child Jesus. Very beautifully done. It looks like it's on glass, reverse glass painting, which is a technique in folk art. Next. And this also is a Romanian, Eastern European painting on glass of the Nativity, with the baby Jesus there in the middle, and Joseph to the left and Mary to the right. She looks pregnant again, but I don't know. Next. This, of course, is a Catholic print, which is a common type of print, lithograph, done in the new style of lithography, which was developed in Europe and spread to America in the 19th century. It's St. Francis, and around the edge are pictures showing his story from the little flowers of St. Francis and other sources. This is a common type of Catholic art, which was found in many homes with devotion to this particular saint, and so forth. It's a print. It's not folk art. It's popular art, but it relates to what I was talking about. Thank you. Next. And this, of course, is another very fancy type of Catholic saint picture. Who is this, Leonard? Is this Saint Francis Xavier?
Ignatius Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits.
And it's interesting that it's surrounded by lace, and many of these things were made in nunneries. The lace, especially, was one of the products of some of the nuns who were interested in popular art. This is actually a very beautiful piece, and it shows the saint with his halo and his symbols and so forth. Next. This is an ex voto, and it's from a new book. I should say that I have in my folk art collection most of the European ex voto books that they've come out of Germany, Switzerland, Austria, Italy. We have very few books on the ex voto in English. This is one of the very first of them. It's a book which I will show you the title called Grace is Received. It's for the, it describes and includes the collection of ex votos that Leonard has put together in his teaching career. And this shows a typical, they're all from Italy. This is dated 1892, September, Grazia ricevuta, grace received. They sometimes just put GR, meaning that, and it means that this person who was hurt in the accident of the wagon turning over prayed to this shrine, to the Virgin. It's a shrine, and there's the Virgin and her divine child. This is typical. It shows the source of power that was applied in the prayer and in the vow, and evidently the person survived this accident and put this memorial of an ex voto in the church where he prayed, where the prayers were said for him. Next. And this is a typical one also of a sick person lying in bed with an attendant, a mother or wife, and they're looking up to the source of power, which was prayed to, and the person evidently survived the sickness, and that looks like, is it Christopher and Christ, Leonard? Who are they?
Saint Anthony. Saint Anthony. Saint Anthony.
Oh, okay. Then this is interesting because as examples of folk art, the ex voto shows the world of the votant, the person who made the prayer. It shows the cross above the bed. It shows the very simple furniture, and it has the inscription GR, Grazia ricevuta, 1717, something like that, and the name of the person. You get a view. These are very important because they often showed common people's interiors of their houses and so forth. Next. This is the cover of the book, and I was pleased to see that Joseph Shora, who also was a student of mine at Penn, is one of the editors of this book called Grace is Received, which is a study of the collection of ex votos by Leonard Primiano. He has a marvelous essay describing what the ex voto is. Next. This is typical Protestant art. Technically, it has a lot of decoration, but we're not certain what they all mean. Tulips can mean anything. Unicorns. We didn't know who this artist was until I discovered who he was. He was called the unicorn artist because he put unicorns on all of his taufschein. And this is from the Moncontongo area, where my own Dutch heritage comes from. It's a very beautiful piece and we have at least a dozen pieces like this, but this is unique because at the very bottom of the text, which is about families in the Moncontongo area, it says, Gemacht von C.B., made by C.B., and I identified him as Christian Beschler, who was the first school teacher in the Moncontongo Valley. He taught in a school that my family, one of my ancestors, built for the community. And this is it's a taufschein, a baptismal certificate, or a birth and baptismal certificate of the Hoberger family. And the church there was called the Hoberger's Church, where he was the schoolmaster, this man, Christian Beschler. Next. This is another one. Unfortunately, we don't know who did this fraktur. It's dated in the 1770s, if I recall. but he's usually called the blousy angel artist because he portrayed these rather stout angels floating in the air above the medallion, which includes the text. And then he decorated the sides of the text with fantastic stylized flowers. They are not representational flowers. Again, fraktur, folk art, is non-representational, and it also abhors a vacuum, and because every space is normally filled. And again, this there are many pieces of fraktur by this particular artist, but so far he has not been identified. He probably was in a Reformed church and was a schoolmaster, but we don't have his name. Next. This is a very handsome piece, again by an unknown artist, but he's called the geometrical artist because he used geometrical designs and he used these handsome columns to frame his work. Again, this is a Taufschein, dated 1773, if I can read it from here, in the Tulpehoven Valley in Berks County, Pennsylvania. Typical Protestant art, stressing the text, but with some decoration. Next. This is one of the handsomest pieces of fraktur that was ever made. It was done by a minister, not by a schoolmaster, a minister named Georg or George Geislight, who served several Reformed parishes in eastern Pennsylvania, and this was done about 1800. And the verse is, Ich will den Herrn loben alle Zeit. I will praise the Lord at all times. And this is very important because he has all sorts of animals around and flowers, stylized flowers. Again, it's typical folk art, and it's interesting how he uses a huge eye. The initial eye of each is enlarged, and then large text up above, and then cursive writing down below. Next. This is another fraktur. This is printed. This was done for Friedrich Krebs, who was a traveling schoolmaster in several counties of Pennsylvania, and it's dated, what, 1762, is it? But it was probably done much later than that. The birth was in 1760, if I recall. And this was printed. Krebs went to a country printer and had it printed, and then he would fill out the text and be paid for it by the family, and decorated with the parrots and the crown above, the basket below, whatever that is, the stars and the tulips. They sometimes said that the tulips represented the Trinity because you could draw them in three parts, but I think that's rather fantastic. Next. This is another fraktur about the blood of Christ, which was used in theology and devotion in both Catholic, counter-Reformation Catholicism and in pietistic Protestantism. They had a great many hymns and frakturs about the blood of Christ. Next. This is a modern fraktur, and it said, I saw a stranger, and they put out food for him and drink for him, and at the bottom it says, Christ often comes as a stranger, this interesting devotional idea. This is done by a woman named Landis, an iconic Pennsylvania Dutch name, and she uses some of the symbols, the flat part, and the tulips, and the bird, which is singing, and it's a very handsome piece, which shows that in some cases fraktur is still alive by modern artists. Next. This is what some people did with their fraktur pieces. This is a spiritual house blessing, a geistliche Haussegen, and it's done in print and manuscript, and it's pasted on the inside of the lid of a chest. And every person, boys as well as girls, were given these chests to prepare for marriage, to keep their clothing and other things in. And sometimes we still find them with these pieces attached. And in Sweden, Dr. Bringeus, whom I mentioned in my lecture, the greatest European scholar on the print culture and religious prints living today, calls them schistbreva, kistbrev. Kist means chess in Swedish, and brev means a document. We have the word briefcase. It doesn't mean that you carry letters in a briefcase, you carry documents in a briefcase. And a brief that's presented to a court is a document, it's not a letter. So brev and brief are used in this earlier sense. Next. It's used also in the word himmelsbrief. This is a Pennsylvania Dutch document, a very beautifully printed example of complete text with no decoration except the borders. It's called a himmelsbrief, which means a heaven letter, or a letter from heaven. In this case, it's a letter supposedly written by Christ himself and sent down on the clouds to Germany. And it says that people are supposed to celebrate the Christian Sabbath on Sunday, and it goes into dress, and they're not supposed to dress in fashionable dress and so forth. It is very popular. It also says it will protect the house or the person on which it is found. And many of these have been folded up and carried in all the wars that Pennsylvania Dutch people fought in. And I used to take groups to Europe in the summer of adults, not of students. One of the women, the Dutch women, at the end of the tour gave me her himmelsbrief that she had carried along on the trip. And she came to Pennsylvania safely. Anyway, this is believed to protect the person who carries it, and they also framed it. They did frame this document and put it up on the walls of the living room or the dining room of the house. It's a very beautiful example, but there are hundreds of these printed examples. The earliest one is dated in Pennsylvania, 1811. Next. This is an English himmelsbrief, a letter written by our blessed Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. This is a very rare one. It also has a description of Jesus in some apocryphal literature, the letter of Lentulus to the Senate of Rome, and it was popular among the extra-biblical ideas that were circulated in documents in the early Christian period. This is an extremely rare piece. Next. This is published in Harrisburg, the capital of Pennsylvania, by a German immigrant printer who printed for the Pennsylvania Dutch, Gustavus Peters, and it's called The Life and Age of Man. And it shows from the birth of the child to the left, the young boy with his toys, and the soldier, and the finely developed person at the 12 o'clock time, and then down, bent over and so forth until finally the person is dead. And it's symbolized with the living tree to the left and the dead tree to the right. This was a common European print, and some of them combine men and women on both the sides of the ladder, and so forth. It's a common motif that was used in the folk prints of Europe and America. And somehow, this Peters print, there was one done in Connecticut or Massachusetts, somewhat like this, and I think scholars are not sure which one was first. I think that has to be settled. I'd like to know. Next. This is another very popular print that was published by Peters in Harrisburg about 1830, showing it's called the Two Ways, or the New Jerusalem print. The New Jerusalem is that handsome city up there with Christ in the gateway, and the people are going up over the rocky road to the New Jerusalem. They're carrying their burdens, and Peters put an igloo there among the saints going up to Jesus to be saved. They're going through the gate that has the cross over it, and then there are those who start out on the narrow way, but they end up in hell just as well. And then down at the bottom are the fashionably dressed people and so forth, and they're going to perdition. This was a very popular print. It went through many editions, and it's based on European prints which look very much the same. Next. Adam and Eve were popular because these were prints done in Reading by Heinrich Saga, the printer, and it showed the tree of knowledge and the apple tree, which we are both an apple, snake tempting Eve, and there's Adam, and they're decorously covered. One of my favorite Adam and Eve prints has Adam and Eve dressed in little Masonic aprons, which made it very decorous. But this shows this was one of the prints which was popular because it showed naked human beings, which you weren't supposed to look at in Protestantism and in Catholicism either. And so this was based on models. All folk art is based on models from a higher level. And the next picture will show you what this was based on. Dürer is a magnificent picture of Adam and Eve. Next. This is showing a book, the New Testament, published at Halle, the Lutheran Center in the 1780s. And it says, Anna Elisabeth Koch in ihr Buch, January 1791. Anna Elizabeth Koch, her book, January 1791. And that's Leonard's finger there. Next. This is not folk art, but it's very beautiful, beautiful Renaissance painting of Saint Christopher, who's been demoted by the Vatican Council and Christ, riding on his shoulders, and Peter with the keys. Again, for Catholic devotion, this is a good example. Next. And I put this in because I had a very wonderful experience which involved the 14 Holy Helpers. I went with an archivist friend. We rented a car and drove from Wertheim in the Main Valley to Bamberg, and up north of Bamberg in Upper Franconia. There is a pilgrimage church called 14 Heiligen, the 14 holy saints, 14 saints. And we were there on a Sunday morning early enough that we watched the peasants coming in their Bavarian costumes, coming to worship in one of the most beautiful Baroque churches I have seen in Europe. And it was devoted to the cult of the 14 Holy Helpers, as they are called in English, or 14 Heiligen. The church was on a cliff looking over a broad valley, and across the valley was another pilgrimage church called Banz, B-A-N-C. But it was great to be at that pilgrimage church and see the people worshiping and hear the music, terrific organ music and so forth. And the interior of the church I will never forget. So this is a book by Father Bonaventure Hammer on the 14 Holy Helpers. Next. And this is Protestantism. Again, to end with that, Jesus is coming soon. And this curious idea that Jesus is going to come back, the second coming of Christ, is of course held by some Protestants, but the liberal Protestants and moderate Protestants have shelved this idea. It's not important to them. But I think that it's a good way to close. Thank you all again for your attention.
He's University Research Professor at Memorial University of Cleveland, where he's taught courses and published on material culture, vernacular architecture, medieval art and architecture, public sector folklore, and museum studies since 1977. He received his PhD in Folklore and Folklife in 1979 at the University of Pennsylvania, and is a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada.
Thank you. I'm going to be very brief in my remarks because we all have lots of questions for Don, and you're here to hear Don, not me, really. I just want to say first that it's a real honor to be here tonight and to be in the presence of such a remarkable scholar as Don Yoder. He is an inspiration for all of us. People come up to me and ask me when I'm going to retire, and I think of Don, who has never retired. And it's like the Energizer Bunny, so he's clearly one of the legends, as Leonard said, in our field. One thing, just to start off, before I specifically just comment on very few things about Don's talk, I realized tonight that it's 50 years since Don's article, The Folklife Studies Movement, was published. That was published in July 1963. And I just thought, picture the world in 1963 in folkloristics. You know, it was a world of song and narrative and a bit of superstition and little else. And Don's article really, when we look back on it, I think really shows his vision and his scope in terms of where he saw our future going. He mentioned just in the article briefly that we should be looking at farming and cooking and dress and ornament and houses and settlement and handicraft and trade and transportation, amusements, arts, marriage, family, religion, among other things. And he really, I think looking back, inspired many of us to go in ways that we never really dreamed of in those early days. Just in terms of very, very briefly, I too read Richard Weiss years ago in Don's classes, and the whole issue of the Catholicism being religion of objects and imagery, and Protestantism being religion of the word. That always was useful in my thinking, but as I thought about what Don was saying today, I realized too that it's perhaps a blurred dichotomy there in many ways. We think of certainly the medieval world as a world of objects, and those objects have power, but it's the power of all objects, that power that Robert Plant Armstrong wrote about as the affecting presence, and objects being brought into place. Perhaps we don't think of some objects as necessarily religious, but I think that all of us are affected and moved, and perhaps even in a spiritual way, by objects, whether they were Catholic or Protestant traditions. And the whole idea of Catholicism, Roman Catholicism, being primarily object-centered in terms of its inspiration, I think of the whole shift in the Gothic world with the building of Saint-Denis Abbey and Bernard of Clairvaux and so on, where Catholicism was really wrestling with this imagery issue and trying to bring in a reformed notion of its belief system, where light becomes the key element rather than pictorial definitions. And then we get to Protestantism with literacy, and the Protestantism as a belief system of the word obviously requires literacy. But I thought of my work on Newfoundland gravestones, and in fact I realized that these were very literate texts with inscriptions, and in fact most of the people in those contexts using those texts were illiterate. They could not read those words. And so words became, I think, as much symbols of power as anything. They became like those religious images on the wall. And who had power? Well, the elite had power, and therefore these magical symbols of words that you hung on your wall, like the Savior's letter, which was common in Newfoundland. People couldn't read it, but it was power. And I think Don points out that one of the critiques of Protestantism is that there's no more mystery, miracle, and magic. And of course, as Don mentioned, we have John Wesley's emphasis on ecstasy, and we have religious trances and conversion experiences. And so Protestantism, has different versions, I think, of what I would consider as mystery and miracle and magic. And just finally, one thing that Don touched on, and I have been working on last year. Actually, I started working on it because of Leonard's article on True Blood, the music from one of my favorite TV series, the vampire series True Blood. I became very interested in blood as an image. And of course, a couple of my Protestant graduate students are always horrified when I show them pictures of the Sacred Heart and all this blood dripping. And then I realized that they were listening to their bluegrass music of, are you washed in the blood, in the soul cleansing blood of the Lamb? There's a fountain flowing for the soul unclean, will be washed in the blood of the Lamb. And the whole verbal description of this blood fountain drenching people, they had no trouble with that, but the Sacred Heart was disturbing to them. And it's curious, that how we draw boundaries that are often not there. But let me just finish. As I say, I don't want to take up Don's time, but I just want to finish with I was reading Bob St. George's article on the Folklife studies movement and material culture studies, and he just ended that essay when he said, when he first, talking about Don, when he first outlined the heuristic promise of the Folklife studies approach over 40 years ago, and now we can say 50 years ago, Don Yoder caused the winds of intellectual change to shift, in part because of his example, and in part because of the work of many other scholars working in his slipstream. Those winds are blowing still. So I look forward to the next Don Yoder lecture given by Don Yoder in about 7 years. And his slipstream will still be flowing around us all and pushing us forward to new and better things. So thank you, Don.
So we have a few minutes for a few questions. If someone would like to speak, there's a microphone. It's on here. Questions?
Silence is very important.
Silence is very.
What can you say a little bit about your new project? I heard you're writing a book on the German Bible in America.
Yes, that's true. It's a very important book, and I'm doing a book on the Amish, an introduction. We need a new introduction to the Amish. There's so much written on them. And I've been doing a lot of forewords. I did the foreword to the Exile book, and I did the foreword to a very interesting Amish book called Outside of Paradise. Paradise is a place in Lancaster County, which is an Amish center, and it's done by John Fisher, who was born in the Old Order Amish faith, and he describes this. It's the only frank autobiography that's been written by an Amishman. He's an ex-Amishman, of course, and he can be frank, and it's the only Amish autobiography that even mentions the S word, sex. The Amish didn't practice sexual matters, and he's very frank about all this. And he also is frank about the fact that his family was a dysfunctional family. He was the 11th of 15 children, if you can imagine that. And he describes the relation with his siblings and so forth, and the struggles between the big boys and the little boys, and so forth. It's a priceless matter. Unfortunately, I didn't bring the book along, but my foreword is very laudatory about this book. And I began by using the statement by Jan Romain, a Dutch scholar, Holland Dutch scholar, who wrote a book on biography. And he said that biographies and autobiographies normally arise in culture in times of crisis, like the Renaissance and the Reformation, when Europe was convulsed with new ideas and reforms. And at that time, in those times, he says, individuals arise who shape history, and they oppose the institutional authorities. And unfortunately for the Amish, individualism and so forth is really pride, hoogmoed, according to the Amish sin list, and it's at the top of the Amish sin list to be too individualistic. And that's why little Amish girls have dolls that have faces without faces. There's no face on their dolls because they're not supposed to emphasize individualism. So I said that the Amish, with this rejection of the culture around them and rejection of individualism, are not sensible of making history, except possibly as silent witnesses to religious freedom, which they are, of course. But the book is important, and I think my foreword is important also. But I've written a lot of forewords recently. I wrote one to a book by Daniel Grimminger, who teaches ethnomusicology at Kent State University. He wrote a book on Protestant hymnody. And that's something that has interested me. And I once thought of writing a book called The Manna Tree, Essays in Protestant Hymnody. And I got the term manna tree from a Pennsylvania spiritual. You know that I wrote a book on Pennsylvania spirituals, the German ones. This was an English spiritual that Methodists used to sing. It has the lines, "When Jesus shook the manna tree, some fell for you, some fell for me." And I like that because it's completely anachronistic. It was Moses that was connected with the manna story in the book of Exodus, not Jesus. But it also has the idea of me and you being in a fellowship, which the church is. And I was going to call the book The Manna Tree, Essays in Protestant Hymnody. I still have lots of chapters that I've written on that, but I don't know whether the book will ever be published. But I think that's an interesting idea. And by the way, our speaker mentioned the blood hymns. My favorite one is, "There is a fountain filled with blood, drawn from Emmanuel's veins, and sinners plunged beneath that flood lose all their guilty stains." That says it all. But there was the cult of the blood, the wounds of Jesus in the Counter-Reformation, and the Moravians in Pennsylvania took that over, and they sang hymns about the Wunden, Wunden, Wunden. There was one hymn that had only the word Wunden in, wounds. And they got so fanatic about the wounds of Christ that they had to be called back by their leaders from that type of devotion. It went to extremes. It was what I would call edelkitsch, not kitsch. I was going to do a book on powwowing, on this curious type of the use of charms and the attempt to heal what's wrong with mankind and of animals. There's a veterinary side to powwowing too. The only thing Indian about it is the name. Everything came from Europe. The ancestors brought these ideas that you can cure illness by saying a charm over the sick person or animal. And I have boxes and boxes of wonderful material from the 19th and 18th century about this type of healing, but I'm turning it all over to this brilliant young student, Patrick Dunmoyer, who just did the magnificent book on hex signs. I'm sorry I didn't bring the hex sign book along to show this crowd, but it's worth knowing about. And he has ideas of the hex sign. It means witch signs. The word hex means witch in German, and hexerai means witchcraft. And there was a silly idea. There was a New England Yankee named, what was his name, Henry? Nutting, Wallace Nutting, who wrote a very charming book called Pennsylvania Beautiful in 1924. But he has a picture of a Pennsylvania barn, a full-page picture showing the barn stars or hex sign, and he says that the individual sign is called a hexafus, a witch's foot. And fortunately, this term didn't register itself in the scholars' war that came about that book. But people began to argue about it. He said that the hex signs were put on the barns to protect the barn from witchcraft and the animals in the barn. And the opposite idea was that, no, they're just decorations. They have nothing to do, no occult symbolism. But there are other theories. I propose the idea that they are symbols of ethnic identity. They weren't put on the barns until after the Civil War. And if you believe in witchcraft, this is a very secret thing. You don't paint stars on the front of your barn out visible from the road to advertise that you believe in witchcraft. That's a silly idea. They were, in a sense, just decorations. But Patrick Dunmoyer has some interesting ideas. He speaks of them as celestial imagery, and they must have had some meaning to the people, the painters who put them on the barns, and the owners of the barns, even after the Civil War. And I think that's a beautiful idea, because the heavens were in our religion, and the influence of the heavens and so forth. So that's another important thing that Patrick Dunmoyer has developed. He also found that if you want to find protection of the barn, you have to look inside and look at the rafters. Sometimes there's a peg put into the rafter. You take the peg out, and inside the hole is a German inscription on paper to protect the barn, like a blessing. So you don't advertise this to the public by putting barn stars on the outside of the barn, but you do it on the inside. And he also found graffiti of the barn. The painters evidently, and probably the boys of the family, drew the barn stars inside the barn also. He found a lot of evidence of that. So the book is very interesting, and he has, in the last 5 years, he's photographed more hex sign barns than anyone else, and he's a master photographer. They're beautiful color plates in the book. And I mentioned the whirling swastika that suggests the movement of the sun. At least that was the theory that they developed in Europe. The swastika, in this case, has nothing to do with Hitler and the Third Reich. It's an ancient symbol, and it's supposed to go back to China and India and so forth in the art of those peoples. So let's see if there's anything else. My first books were on religion, of course, because I began in the religious thought department in Penn, and my professor at the University of Chicago invited me to come there. Since he was head of the new religion department, Penn was rather secular in its history and didn't like the idea of a religion department until the 20th century. And he died. I was in Europe, and I heard that he had died. And I and a colleague kept the religious thought department going. I told you this morning, some of you, for 4 years, until the dean finally had to appoint a chairman of the department and then hire some other people. But my first work was in religious history, the history of American religion. That was my specialty, and it still is one of my specialties. And a lot of my early work shades over into that field.
It's 9:45.
I think it's time to.
Well, I could go on and on, but